War is often understood through its brutal calculus, the number of divisions, the tonnage of bombs, the grim tally of the dead. We seek to explain victory and defeat through the logic of systems, of industrial might versus tactical brilliance, and in the grand narrative of the Second World War, the defeat of the Third Reich is frequently attributed to the overwhelming material power of the Allies. This explanation is not wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete. It fails to account for a weapon far more subtle, and in many ways more psychologically devastating than any tank or bomber. It was a weapon deployed not on the battlefield, but in the quiet heart of the American homeland, and it would leave thousands of German soldiers questioning the very foundations of the ideology for which they had fought and bled. The conventional story of prisoners of war is one of barbed wire and deprivation. But for tens of thousands of German soldiers held in the United States, their captivity included an experience so paradoxical, so utterly contrary to their worldview, that it bordered on the surreal. They were invited into American homes. They sat at American tables. They shared Sunday dinner with the families of the very men their comrades were fighting to kill in Europe. This is not a story about superior numbers. It is a story about a clash of realities. A psychological battle fought not with bullets, but with apple pie and quiet conversation. To understand how a simple act of hospitality could become a tool of ideological warfare, we must first understand the world these German soldiers had left behind. For the German Lanzer, the soldier of the Wehrmacht, reality was defined by two immovable forces: the absolute authority of the National Socialist state and the existential brutality of the front. Theirs was a universe built on a rigid hierarchy of command and a racial ideology that dehumanized their enemies. The world, as they were taught to see it, was a brutal struggle for survival, where mercy was weakness and humanity a dangerous illusion. Nazi propaganda had painted a vivid picture of the United States, a mongrel nation, decadent, selfish, and morally bankrupt. American soldiers were portrayed as cowards, their society a chaotic mess incapable of true discipline or courage. To be captured by such an enemy was to face, at best, cruelty and humiliation, at worst, a vengeful death. This was the expectation seared into the minds of the over 400,000 German prisoners of war who were shipped across the Atlantic between 1942 and 1945. The first shock came not in the prison camps, but during their journey to them. Instead of the ruined, struggling nation they had been led to expect, they saw bustling harbors, cities illuminated at night, and a civilian population that seemed utterly untouched by the privations of war. Their train journeys inland became a rolling panorama of a continent's vast, unassuming power. They saw endless farmland, larger than German provinces, and an abundance of food and consumer goods that seemed mythical to men accustomed to years of rationing. The camps themselves were the next layer of this psychological assault. Expecting squalor and starvation, they instead found conditions that were, for many, better than what they had experienced as soldiers in Hitler's army. The United States adhered strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention. This meant prisoners received clean beds, medical care, and food rations equivalent to those of American soldiers. For men who had survived the frozen hell of the Eastern Front or the desperate fighting in North Africa, the simple fact of 3 meals a day with real meat, milk, and fruit was a profound and disorienting experience. One former prisoner of the Afrika Korps, captured in Tunisia, would later write in his diary about the sheer astonishment of being served food he hadn't seen in years, a stark contrast to the thin soups and ersatz coffee that had become his reality. But the true turning point, the experience that would irrevocably alter their perception of the enemy, came as a result of a quintessentially American problem: a labor shortage. With millions of American men overseas, farms and factories were in desperate need of workers. The government established a program to use low-risk POWs as a labor force. Tens of thousands of German prisoners were sent to work in canneries, mills, and, most consequentially, on small family farms across the rural heartland. Here, the core conflict of our story is laid bare. On one side, you have the system, the rigid, top-down, ideologically driven machinery of the Third Reich. It taught that the individual was subordinate to the state, that enemies were subhuman, and that all interactions were to be governed by dominance and suspicion. On the other side, you have humanity, the spontaneous, personal, and unpredictable interactions of ordinary people. In the fields of Nebraska, the orchards of Michigan, and the cotton farms of Arkansas, these two forces would collide. At first, the interactions were cautious. Guards were present, and language was a barrier. But the shared work of the land created a common ground. American farmers, many of German descent themselves, began to see not the monstrous Nazi of the propaganda posters, but young men, far from home, who knew how to fix a tractor or bring in a harvest. Slowly, tentatively, the barriers began to fall. A cup of coffee on the porch became a sandwich in the kitchen, and then something extraordinary happened. The invitations began. Across the country, in small towns and rural communities, American families began inviting the German prisoners who worked their land to join them for Sunday dinner. It was not a government program. It was a grassroots phenomenon, a series of individual decisions that, collectively, amounted to a profound act of psychological warfare. For the German soldiers, stepping across the threshold of an American home was like entering another dimension. Everything they saw contradicted what they had been taught. The homes were modest, but filled with a casual abundance. Pantry shelves stocked with food, functioning appliances, a sense of peaceful domesticity that had vanished from Germany years before. They were treated not as prisoners, but as guests. Mothers would encourage them to take second and third helpings of roast meat and apple pie. Fathers would offer them a cup of coffee and ask, through broken English, or with the help of a family member who spoke some German, about their lives back home. Children, initially shy, would bring out board games or show off their schoolwork. One prisoner's letter home captured the profound disbelief felt by many. He wrote, "Today, something happened that I still cannot comprehend. The farmer, Mr. Bishop, whose fields we had been working, invited myself and 2 others into his house for the midday meal. His wife served us as if we were honored guests. We sat at their family table. For 2 hours we were not prisoners. We were just men. I do not know how to reconcile this with what I have been told. Are these the people we are supposed to hate?" This experience was a radical contradiction to everything their ideology had taught them. The Nazi system was built on dehumanization. It required its followers to see others, Jews, Slavs, and, yes, Americans, as less than human, as abstractions to be hated and destroyed. But it is impossible to dehumanize someone who has just passed you the mashed potatoes. The kindness they received wasn't part of a formal re-education program. It was something far more powerful. It was voluntary. This distinction was crucial. It wasn't a rule to be obeyed, but a choice freely given by the enemy. To fully grasp the psychological impact of these Sunday dinners, we must remember the alternative. On the Eastern Front, the war was one of annihilation. The Geneva Convention was a distant fiction. Soviet prisoners of war in German hands died by the millions from starvation, disease, and summary execution. The death rate was over 57%. For German prisoners in Soviet captivity, the fate was nearly as grim, with a mortality rate approaching 36%. In American and British-run camps, the mortality rate for German prisoners was less than 1%. This was the brutal reality of the war these men knew, and it was this reality that made the quiet humanity of an American Sunday dinner so profoundly unsettling. The psychological climax for these men was not a single event, but a slow, dawning realization. The cognitive dissonance became unbearable. The world as presented by the Nazi Party was a lie. The enemy was not the monster they had been told. The American system, which their leaders had derided as weak and chaotic, had produced a level of prosperity and quiet confidence that was simply overwhelming.
The American people, depicted as selfish and decadent, were demonstrating a capacity for individual kindness that defied all logic of war.
As one former prisoner recalled decades later in an interview, it broke something in you. Not your spirit, no. It broke the certainty. We were so sure of our view of the world. And then you see a small child, an American child, who is not afraid of you. She offers you a cookie. In that moment, the entire structure of hate, it becomes ridiculous. It simply falls apart. This was the true defeat, not on the battlefields of Normandy or in the ruins of Berlin, but in the kitchens of Kansas and the living rooms of South Carolina. It was the moment their worldview was shattered by an undeniable new reality. The Nazi ideology could withstand bombs and bullets. It was designed for a world of brutal conflict. But it had no defense against a simple, unreciprocated act of human decency. When these men were finally repatriated, they returned to a homeland in ruins, a nation grappling with the moral and physical catastrophe of the Nazi regime. They brought back with them not just memories of their captivity, but stories that directly contradicted the official narrative of the war. In towns and villages across Germany, these returning soldiers told their families and neighbors of a prosperous America, of respectful guards, and, most astonishingly, of Sunday dinners with strangers. The legacy of this quiet, unofficial program is difficult to measure, but it is profound. For many of these former prisoners, their time in the United States planted the seeds of a new perspective. It showed them a different model of society, one built not on rigid control and manufactured hatred, but on individual liberty and a surprising capacity for compassion. Many of these men became advocates for democracy and played a role in the rebuilding of West Germany as a key American ally in the Cold War. Post-war letters from former prisoners to the American families who had hosted them speak of a gratitude that lasted for decades, a human connection forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. The big idea that emerges from this forgotten chapter of the war is this. Ideologies of hate are, at their core, systems of abstraction. They function by reducing complex human beings to simple monolithic symbols of the enemy. They require distance and dehumanization to survive. The most effective weapon against such an ideology is not necessarily a bigger bomb or a more powerful tank. It is proximity. It is the power of the personal, the specific, and the human to dismantle the abstract. An apple pie offered freely to an enemy can, in its own quiet way, be as powerful as a battalion of tanks. It does not win a battle, but it can utterly vanquish the hatred that fuels the war itself. In the final analysis, the story of the German prisoners of war and their Sunday dinners is a testament to a startling truth. It reveals that the most resilient structures are not always built of steel and concrete, but of trust and empathy. And that sometimes the most profound victory in a war is not the unconditional surrender of an enemy army, but the quiet, voluntary surrender of an enemy's hatred, achieved not on a battlefield, but across a dinner table.